about this a little bit in the beginning, and I'll throw it to you all, is the question of buy-in. Doing an assessment, it takes time. It takes time for folks to do that. So how do you get buy-in from your administration to start an assessment program?
I can start to answer that question. I won't make any promises that it will be the complete answer. I think one super valuable way is to begin to just simply have conversations about where we are at and where we want to go, without ever using the word assessment. That is assessment, right? Identifying where we are succeeding with what we have, and then also where we might be falling short. And then linking that into some of the concepts and principles that we've talked about today, introduces the vocabulary that there is more to assessment than just having conversations. It's gathering data and it's identifying those outcomes. The most effective way I have found, as I've worked through assessment on my own campus and with different people across the country and the world, is to invite all that are able to attend that assessment institute and have those conversations in that concentrated window of time. Tends to have the most impact because it is designed to allow that conversation to happen and to begin.
So speaking of kind of the assessment process, and say you've gotten it. So now one of the questions is, so what's the ideal timeline for that assessment cycle? Can someone talk us through that? Might be you again, Dan. Isaiah.
So I can go ahead and jump in on that one. I wouldn't say that this is prescriptive, it may be more descriptive, but most of the assessment cycles are typically an annual cycle. And I've seen these line up several ways. I've seen them align with the academic calendar. I've seen some schools that do it along with the fiscal calendar. Some do it by the normal calendar, whatever you want to call it, the one that starts in January, ends in December. So there are different ways you can slice it up, but these are typically annual cycles. Now, I have seen some schools that have condensed the cycles, and so they made these 6-month cycles, and that was often in an effort to have multiple cycles. And really, it was in response to some accreditation issues that they were having. They wanted to have multiple cycles, but I would say the norm is definitely one year, however you define year.
I think it's also important to note that we're not talking about assessing every single outcome in your office all of the time. An effective assessment cycle will focus in on 2, maybe 3 outcomes that are really important for where you're at in the moment. And so that cycle may look different timing wise, but as Isaiah mentioned, a yearly cycle tends to allow you to see that from the beginning to the end with certain students and or with different dynamics that exist on your campus.
Okay, so another question came in, and this might be a bit specific, but we'll see if we can make it a bit broader. So when referring to those ideas of outcomes, the student and the advisor outcomes, should those be unique from one another, or can they kind of overlap? So an example was given, like if a student outcome is to attend 3 advising sessions in a year, can the advisor outcome then be to see a student 3 times a year? So what are your thoughts on that?
I can try and take that one.
Sounds good.
Dan a break. Yeah, I mean, I think you can certainly structure the advisor outcomes parallel to your student learning outcomes, because obviously when you set up your student learning outcomes, you're identifying the fact that your advising staff have to take certain steps in order to help students meet those student learning outcomes. And so your advisor outcomes then help define what those steps are. They can be very helpful for advisors to know what it is they should be doing, how they should concentrate on their work or focus their efforts in order to really enhance, or that's not the right word, but improve those student learning outcomes throughout the year. So yes, I think you're on the right track, that this advisor outcomes often do parallel the student learning outcomes. But there might also be some additional advisor outcomes, because it might be that you have a student learning outcome about knowing exactly what degree program requirements they have to complete. And for the advisor, just being able to instruct the student on those degree program requirements is one thing, but how do you get the advisor up to the point of knowing the degree program requirements as well? So there might be some additional advisor outcomes that may allude more to training and development along the way.
I always am quick to say it's my soapbox, so I have to jump in, sorry, that you are not actually looking for advisors just to be expert students. You are looking at advisors to be so much more than just somebody who knows exactly how to get through the university process. So although it's a perfect and wonderful place to start, I think it's really important to identify that there's so much more that goes into that interaction with a student that also needs outcomes for your advisors, as well as the continuous improvement that exists in an advisor setting that is outside of just registering for classes or learning the information that your college needs them to know.
Perfect. So kind of talking about, so we're in that outcomes area. When we're thinking about, we start with the vision and the mission and goals. Do those have to be recreated for each cycle, or do we kind of work through them and recreate? So talk us through like that sort of idea of the vision, mission, goals in the beginning process of the assessment cycle.
I can take that one. So you won't recreate your vision, mission, goals for every single assessment cycle. Those should be pretty static for some time. You might want to revisit them every few years, maybe every 3 years, every 5 years, or if there's some major change that's happened at the university, like maybe now you have a new population that you're advising, and your previous vision, mission, goals didn't necessarily consider that population. So you might want to consider revising them, but it's not something that you would do on an annual basis. They would, take you through an assessment cycle, or a few assessment cycles at least.
Perfect. And kind of pairing along with that, when you're thinking about the assessment cycle, are we focused on our unit's vision, mission, goals? Are we focused on the institution's vision, mission, goals? Are we focused on both? Where do we focus?
So I can jump in on this one because this is one that I see a lot. We're trying to develop system-wide goals as well for advising. So it's kind of one additional layer. So, there was a question earlier about an outcome being 3 meetings, with a student, and then the advisor having 3. I would say that this is one area where I think a lot of people struggle, is really recognizing at what level what they're describing should be slotted. So is this an outcome? Is it a goal? And so what you'll commonly see is like in a strategic plan for a university, there'll be some key performance indicators that I would kind of classify in sort of the goal category. But that might become the mission for advising. It might be something that, university-wide, you're trying to accomplish something. And so the advising office, their primary purpose is to meet that key performance indicator. And likewise, with like an academic affairs division, there may be some goals or even some outcomes. Let's kind of stick with outcomes for a minute. There might be some outcomes that end up being a goal for the whole advising unit. I mean, one of the 3 or 4 goals maybe that the whole unit has. So in that sense, I would say that there needs to be some alignment. I used to use the term mapping, but that kind of confuses things because we use mapping a little bit differently, some terminology, just in terms of the way it's used in academic advising assessment. But if you think about aligning the vision, mission, and goals, I think that kind of helps you get a better sense of really where it's appropriate to slot them in. Because again, going back to the question about 3 meetings with an advisor, if that's an outcome, my next question would be, well, how do we measure that? And it seems like it's a very simple way to measure it. Well, they either had or they didn't have 3 meetings. And so in my mind, that would probably be reduced down to a measure at that point. But then what's the outcome? Maybe it's, we want academic advisors and students to value the relationship with advisors. And so then those meetings become one of the measures maybe instead of the outcome. So it's it's really fluid, I guess, is a short answer that I would give at least.
Perfect. Thank you. This is a little bit of a, this is probably the answer is probably it depends, but the question is, so who has access to your assessment data on your campus? So I'm going to throw it out there just for discussion. Let's talk about data and access and all of that for that assessment data.
It depends. So yeah, I think it could be across the university. So some of it might be internally to your unit. Like it depends on how you collect your data. Some universities might collect it with a software like Starfish, for example, or you might have your own internal way of collecting data through like an Excel sheet or something. Your institutional research department, if you have one at your university, will have a lot of data that you can use, and they can help you pull information from the institution, or if you collect any data from surveys like NUSSE or BESI or two that we've used in the past. But yeah, it does depend, and it can come from across the university. It might be like campus partners have data that might be helpful for you to answer a question. Like if you have something, you know, the Career Center might have some data that you could use. So yeah.
One recommendation, especially that's in the Pocket Guide, or at least alluded to in the Pocket Guide, is that oftentimes we miss out on opportunities to share that data with students. So finding ways in which you can share it in an appropriate and broad term as far as advisor to advisor or different things like that. But the idea that sometimes one of our stakeholders that we overlook quite a lot when we talk about assessment of academic advising are those students that we are interacting with, and would very much benefit from seeing the work we're doing to improve, but also that the shortcomings that we might have, so that they can have a better context of their educational experience as well.
I would add to that too, that it's sort of funny, but a lot of data is different. So even something as basic as head count or semester credit hours, depending on how that's being reported, maybe up to your state or your coordinating board, it can really vary from the way that we use it. So one of the things that I always said was, there were caveats that we would offer up with some of our data. And so this kind of gets to the data access question too. But typically what we're looking at, I think, in academic advising are sort of the more common ways that terms are used. So if we talk about fall enrollment or spring enrollment, we're probably talking about anybody who is enrolled at the university or college, for the fall, maybe from August to December. But some of the IR offices and other offices that might do reporting, they might have a very different definition that maybe counts second 8-week courses with the following semester. So in terms of data access, I would just kind of offer up some of those qualifications with your data too, so that if someone else is looking at it, they don't say, well, your numbers are wrong or something. In terms of the data itself, obviously FERPA is going to play a big role in this, but we typically would not share out raw data if that's what the question is. And so we had some pretty complex outcomes where, like one that comes to mind is we were looking at, we wanted students to register for degree applicable courses. So we're obviously looking there to see, do they have a graduation plan on file? Do they register for the right courses? Is their graduation plan up to date in terms of aligning with their curriculum, all those things. And there were 4 different data sets that we looked at, and we combined these, and there's no way we would have shared that out campus-wide or anything. I mean, it was really an internal kind of report. But other kinds of data, that we mentioned, if it's like student survey data, I personally think that's pretty safe to share out. And on that note too, if you're looking at doing some of these internal changes, these don't have to go through your IRB group at all. Now, if you're looking at publishing some of this data, absolutely, but just wanted to offer that in there too, because that's a question that comes up quite a bit.
We have time for one last question to finish it up. And so it kind of ties in with this. So when you're thinking about some of those assessment items, are you Are you creating them independently? Are you working with your institutional research board? How are you creating some of these assessment items? And this will probably be our last question. So I'm sorry if we did not get to the rest of your questions.
So if we're talking about measures here, I
Mhm.
think it can be a both and or all of the above. But I think it's really starting with what is it that you are hoping to measure? What data do you need to collect, and how can you collect that data? Do you have a system that's already collecting it for you? Do you need to create a survey? And do you have access to survey tools to be able to do that, or does someone else on your campus control that access? I think, there are ways to automate communications. Do you have that access, or again, does somebody else have that control? So I think it's really about what all do you have access to do in your office in terms of creating those measures versus are there folks on campus that you need to work with to develop them along the way?
Perfect. I think that's a perfect answer. Is collaboration is wonderful to work within your team and across the campus. So I just wanted to say thank you to our team here for their presentation today. Thank you for each of you joining us for the presentation.